Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and in this one I'm going to go over my round 1 game from the Eastern Open. Now, if you followed the last video in the series, you know that I just finished a tournament called the Washington Chess Congress in Virginia, and this tournament, the Eastern Open, was about 10 days later and a week before, the weekend before Halloween. I had been playing pretty well this month and was hoping to kind of keep that up in another small weekend event, so it's not really like a norm event necessarily because there aren't enough strong players or enough rounds, but it was an opportunity to maybe get some rating and because it was FIDE rated and just, you know, kind of improve. Now, you typically in these weekend events, I'm, going to be one of the top seeds because there aren't as many strong players that are going to flock to a 5-round tournament that doesn't have a huge cash prize. But there were still a few GMs in the field, and so I think I was the number 5 or 6 seed, and that means that in the first few rounds I'm probably going to play down. So in this one, my opponent was an untitled player I hadn't heard of by the name of Boris. Yes, Boris, someone with 2 first names, and was essentially just a kid that I don't even think was barely a teenager, maybe 13, maybe 14, and rated only 1900, I believe, at the time. But the thing about a lot of these tournaments and the FIDE ratings, particularly with young kids, is they're rarely an accurate depiction of where they are strength-wise. So you always have to be extremely careful in these games because they know way more than their rating will suggest. So I knew I had to be alert and on my toes, and being with the black pieces, I knew it was going to be a challenge. So without further ado, let's get into it. So Peter opened with e4. I played c6. d4, d5, and here we have a Caro Kann, and yeah, I was not sure what line he was going to go for. I would say e5 is probably the most popular at the top level, but a lot of people also love to play knight c3 and get to some line that comes after that, and that's what Peter did. He played knight c3. And after d takes e4, knight takes e4, I played the move knight d7, which is known as the Karpov variation of the Caro Kann. It's not as popular these days as the move bishop f5, I think in part because knight d7 is a little bit trickier to navigate just from a defensive standpoint early on, because there are certain ways that white can get pretty decent pressure on the black position. And so bishop f5 is a little bit safer from that perspective, just because it's difficult to get attacked from the jump. And after knight d7, remarkably, Peter actually thought for a little bit, but played what I consider to be the most challenging move, which is the move knight g5. And this is the line that actually keeps a lot of Caro Kann players away from the Karpov variation, because this line is so dangerous, and it's the move that Kasparov actually lost to Deep Blue in the last game of their match in the late 90s. It was this knight g5 move that put the whole position to the test. And basically the initial idea with this knight g5 move is that it's kind of tricky to challenge. So if you play the move h6, knight e6 is very possible, and the problem is that after f takes e6, there's queen h5 mate. And so just to show that, there's h6, knight e6, and then this is basically a very, very funny mate based upon the fact that the knight is smothering the king. It's taken away its escape score to d7. And so typically you don't challenge that knight right away, and you instead develop. But then the tricky thing is if you go knight gf6 now, white goes bishop d3, and again you can't kick the knight away, because now you've actually managed to cover the h5 square. But after h6, knight e6 now, if you take on f6, there's bishop g6 mate. So there's all these kind of tactical nuances connected to knight g5. And in the game Deep Blue versus Kasparov, there was a queen e2 and knight takes e6 sighting actually when the pawn was on e6. And it went something like this, if I can remember. E6, I think, was knight f3, and then I think h6 here. And even in this position, where black's king is not getting checkmated, the problem is that black's bishop on f8 and the rook on h8 are kind of trapped and dormant because of this bishop that's kind of like a really nice wedge on g6. ultimately white just castled and started to open up the queen side, and Kasparov had to resign in about 20 moves. So that's kind of like, you know, a nightmare scenario for the Caro-Kann player and the Karpov variation, and something that's very, very possible, and you have to be alert to avoid these types of things. But I had a very specific idea in mind that I wanted to try, and so interestingly enough, after the move knight g5, I actually played the move h6. And you might be wondering, why are you doing this? You just said that knight e6 was a move. And I think Peter was also wondering about this, like, did I just forget that knight e6 was an idea in this position? You know, what's going on? Because he actually, you know, was in the tank for about 5-6 minutes. And then he ultimately played knight e6, and then I blitzed out the move queen b6. And this was essentially an idea I'd seen before in some games from a few years ago, that in fact you can actually allow the knight to get to a6 and then just move your queen away. And the idea is that now you're actually trying to take the knight on e6 and essentially secure you know, again, essentially secure a relatively solid structure, but you're giving up the bishop pair to do so. And so it's actually kind of risky to go for this line, but I thought that, you know, if I was able to kind of neutralize the first wave of white's initiative, black might be okay, and the pawn structure that arises after knight takes f8 is actually not so bad for black. So this was actually my idea, is that after knight takes f8, which happened, I played knight takes f8, and it's a very unusual position, almost like a Fischer random position with a knight on f8. But the general idea is that you just play knight f6, bishop f5, this knight pops out to g6 or e6 depending on the circumstance, and you know, you have a relatively solid position, although white does have more space and the two bishops, which you know, does give white the advantage. So computers actually really don't like this line at all. They find this to be just abhorrent in every sense of the word, because again, white has the center and the two bishops. But upon closer inspection, black's position is kind of resilient, and I wanted to kind of just test out how playable it was, and I thought it'd be a good test to play it against someone that, you know, was maybe a bit lower rated than me, just to see, like, can I win playing this way? Is it too risky? And so this was like, you know, was going to be this is kind of my our first opportunity to see what the truth was about this position. So anyways, after knight takes f8, Peter went knight f3. That's a normal and very decent move. And now I went knight f6. Now, you might say, well, why don't you go bishop g4 and actually pin the knight to the queen? Well, the problem is, in some lines, white might be able to play h3 and g4 and kick the bishop further back. But the other thing that I was a little bit concerned about is white's never really threatening to play bishop takes f3. In fact, if white just ignored this and played like c3, knight g6, h3, you note the bishop, if the knight goes to g6, can't actually stay on this diagonal, and it just might actually lose valuable time if it has to go back to f5. And so I thought, yeah, maybe just playing bishop g4 didn't make a lot of sense, because again, you don't want to give up your last bishop as well, because now you're actually really asking for it when this bishop comes to d3, threatening to spoil the pawn structure with f takes g6, and not really having a lot of counterplay in the center right now. It's going to be tough. So instead I played knight f6, white played bishop d3, and now I played the move bishop f5, and this is actually one of the kind of key subtleties of the position, is that you can actually play this move because tactically you can play queen a5 check and actually pick off the light squared bishop. So if bishop takes f5 is played, it was not. Castles was played, but if bishop takes f5, queen a5 check, c3, and queen takes f5, all of a sudden you've actually managed to, you know, get rid of white's two bishop advantage, or the advantage of the bishop pair, and this queen actually is a very decent diagonal where it's kind of manning the light squares that essentially the light square bishop was controlling. So it's not so bad for black. And then you can see that if this knight now develops to g6 or even to d7, black will be ready to castle and, you know, have a relatively stable position. So yeah, that's one of the things, is you actually can put the bishop on f5 instead of on g4. Note that if white played a move like c3, now black should probably consider playing bishop f5 because now the queen a5 check resource isn't possible anymore. So anyways, after bishop d3, bishop f5, castles. Now I actually took on d3. And after queen takes d3, played rook d8. And rook d8 might seem to be a little bit of a strange move at first sight because I mentioned the importance of, putting this knight on g6 or e6 and actually castling. And so you might ask, why are you delaying castling? What's the benefit of doing this? Well, the one thing I thought was, kind of nice is that with the rook on d8 now, the knight on f3 is frozen, at least for a move. And in many positions, white might find it attractive to play knight e5. And so if the knight is on e5, then, this knight on the knight, if it comes to g6, might be not very secure because the queen and a knight on e5 would be controlling that square. And I wasn't too confident about exchanging on e5 with... basically exchanging on e5 and allowing d takes e5. So, for instance, let's say I played knight g6, knight e5 now. Now this knight is kind of under fire, and again, if I take here, after d takes e5, I really have to think white is better because after this knight moves, e6 seems kind of devastating because because this diagonal is so weak, if I have to play a move like f takes e6, queen g6 check is just going to be nearly decisive because my king is stuck in the center and the e file is going to be open and my pawns are very weak now. So didn't really want to allow like some knight e5 idea. And then the other candidate was, well, why don't you play knight e6? Well, it was kind of a weird looking move to make, and I was a little bit concerned that after rook e1, there would be possibilities of rook takes e6, which is actually quite an interesting exchange sacrifice. So, for instance, let's say I castle, then rook takes e6, f takes e6, and I thought this pawn is obviously very weak, but also the g6 square is weak, and already something like queen g6 was of some concern to me because bishop takes h6 might be an idea. Kind of just taking advantage of the pin here. There might be ideas of knight e5 and knight f7, and it just seemed to me like a very, very dangerous looking position where on any move white can actually entertain rook takes e6. He doesn't have to rush with this idea, but it just seemed like something that might even be a pressing danger. So yeah, for all those reasons, I was not really sure about it. And I should also say that there were also some draws that kind of concerned me. So that, let's say this actually happens. Let's say bishop takes h6 first, g takes h6, and now rook e6, f e6, queen g6. I was actually concerned that there might be some repetition with king h8 and king g8, because if I block with knight h7, there's knight g5, and that actually just threatens mate in 1, and there's no reasonable way to stop it, because if you go rook f7, white will just take that rook with check and have a winning position. So the other thing I thought as well, if white can force a repetition here because I can't go knight h7, this is actually not what you want to do against someone that's rated like 500 points lower than you FIDE wise. So yeah, so basically because of those things, I thought rook d8 was a little bit smarter because it discouraged this knight e5 move. It also didn't allow white to pounce with rook takes e6 either. And yeah, I thought now I would develop my knight next. So anyways, after rook d8, white played c3, which I think makes a lot of sense, reinforcing the d4 pawn. An argument could have been made to be a little bit more active because it's not like I have massive pressure on d4 right now, so c4 might be a more challenging move. And then the point would be that if I played a move like knight e6, now white may be able to just play bishop e3 and defend the pawn again. And I think b2 is actually kind of a poisoned pawn because if I play queen takes b2, I think after rook a b1, or excuse me, well, rook f b1 actually appears to just trap the queen. So that's not even a possibility. But even if the queen wasn't trapped and there was a square to go to, rook takes b7 would also be very discouraging. Just kind of a rook on the 7th rank, just kind of running rampant would not be worth the pawn there. But yeah, you can see here that my queen's actually trapped, so it's not even possible. And so I thought here, the bishop coming to e3, not enough pressure on d4. Maybe d5 becomes a break one day, taking advantage of this knight on e6. Just not a very pleasant position to play. So Yeah, so anyways, after rook d8, c3, I did go knight e6 now. And part of the reason I went knight e6 now is because I thought I'm actually threatening c5 in some lines. Now that, black went a little bit passive, I thought that this c5 move would not only cover my knight on e6 with the queen, so that rook e1, rook takes e6 is not as dangerous because I can recapture the queen. I also thought that now I'm actually getting some pressure on the d4 pawn. And again, if the pawn was on c4, then c5 wouldn't really be a threat because white could play d5 and have a protected passed pawn. So that's another reason why I think c4 is actually a little bit more testing. But after knight e6, white played queen e2, now stepping out of the d5. And I was actually happy to see this because, white is actually still, has a very good position, very decent, very healthy pawn structure. But I thought that now the queen's on e2, the rook is not there on the e file, eyeing e6. So it actually gives me time to kind of consolidate. So now I castled, and I thought, okay, this is kind of, pretty solid position. My knights on f6 and e6 are kind of secure. I don't have any immediate pressure, and I might play for a c5 break soon. White now played bishop e3, reasonable move, kind of preempting this c5 break. And I thought now maybe c5 would not be as attractive because essentially there could be scenarios where the queenside pawn majority that happens after the d takes e5 and knight takes e5 might be a little bit annoying for me. And I also thought that I'd at least be temporarily pinning myself if I played c5 right away. So let's just say c5, d takes e5, knight takes e5. Yeah, so like I said, white has this queenside majority. The bishop is lined up against the queen here. I don't think white's winning a piece just yet because if white goes b4, I think I have queen a6. But this is not an attractive position at all. I mean, even here, queen takes a6 and bishop takes a7. White's already up a pawn, and there might even be better than that. Maybe it's even better to just start with queen c4, and maybe white is actually just winning here. But the point is that c5 does not make sense if I'm running into a pin. So anyways, I played queen a5 instead. And the idea here was that instead of preparing for c5, I was going to shift my queen over towards one of these light squares on the king side or in the center and get off of the diagonal so that maybe I can prepare c5 later. And if you remember when I showed you this trick in the opening with the bishop coming to f5 and queen a5 check to recover that bishop, a lot of times this queen a5 move was the key to just get the bishop towards the queen side, towards the king side, where the king would feel a little bit more secure. So after queen a5, white played the move knight e5, and I think this is actually quite an interesting move because it actually just kind of cuts off my queen from the desired square. I was really angling for f5, but now I don't have that privilege, and so I have to kind of take another course of action. And again, c5 is actually not attractive because after d takes e5, knight takes e5, again, b4 is a very, very, annoying, fork. So because of, or skewer rather. So because of that, I have to kind of deal with, basically deal with the new circumstance of the position and try to get my queen, towards the king side with the knight in the way. And I thought the best way to do that would actually be to play the move queen d5, because I'm actually quite insistent now on getting my queen, in this general area, because, this knight is very annoying on e5, and if I allow white to kind of build up an initiative on this side, I think it could be a little bit dangerous. Note that with my knights on, f6 and e6 right now, it's not the easiest thing in the world to actually contest the knight on e5. So what I thought is that now with the knight on e5, c5 is actually more encouraging for me because the knight might be unprotected and the d-pawn can be undermined. So getting my queen to d5 so that it's actually looking at the e5 knight is actually key. So now after queen d5, c5 is actually kind of a threat. Let's say you play a move like h3. Now if I go c5, I'm actually threatening to take on d4. And the really tricky thing is that you can't take on c5 because the knight is hanging. And if you play c4, which looks extremely natural, I actually have a nice mini tactic, knight takes d4, taking advantage of the queen being unprotected on e2. So you can't actually take on d5 without losing like 2 pawns, actually, because I've already won 1 pawn, and now I'm taking on e2 with check, and will recover a second pawn with rook takes d5, and all of a sudden black is completely winning. So this move would actually kind of, in many respects, force the knight back, or ask white to add another piece to the fire. But these types of positions, I think, now are totally fine for black, because you actually have to continue to protect this knight. So you can't take the pawn with the rook and keep your queenside pawn majority. And so a position like this, I now would consider black to actually be a little bit better based upon the structure. So backing up, after queen d5, white actually recognized that c5 was a threat and played the move queen c4. And this move is interesting because, it kind of says, what, I recognize c5 is a threat, but I still think my queenside pawn majority is a factor, and I think I can take that into an endgame. The thing is, I thought that my position was relatively solid, and I don't mind playing endgames in general. So I thought that this was kind of an opportunity for me to kind of show my strengths. And I was actually totally cool with this arrangement. So the question for me was whether to take on c4 right away, or maybe make some other move improving my position before white probably takes on d5. And so I thought for a little while, and then I landed on the move c5. And my idea was that by actually threatening c takes d4 here, and incurring the problem in the pawn structure, I thought I kind of forced white's hand a little bit, and I really thought I was just kind of getting the upper hand. Now, again, let's just say white plays a move like h3. Peter didn't, but let's just say my threat was, now if I play c takes d4, you're kind of obliged to take with the bishop or the pawn. But either way, I'm actually winning a pawn, because after knight takes d4, let's say queen takes d5, some scenario like this, black's just a clear pawn up for nothing. And I thought, black would be, definitely much better here. So already it's kind of funny, because black's actually the one that's initiating the action in the center, and white's last few moves, with queen e2 and knight f3 to e5, if it doesn't seem like white was actually able to maintain the pressure there, and now black is kind of taking over the initiative. And so I thought, I was actually doing quite well here. White now played queen takes d5, and I played the move knight takes d5. And my idea was, in this position now I can essentially train my knight against the bishop on e3, so that in some positions maybe I might consider taking. And I thought this would give me an opportunity to maybe kick the knight away on e5 with the strange-looking move f6, because this knight is really cramping my style right now, and is really the only reason white can entertain a tiny space advantage here. So I thought that was a little bit better than the alternative rook takes d5, because here I thought white could probably go back to the pawn majority positions we were talking about before with the move like knight f3 and threaten d takes c5. Note that in this version, the way I play with knight takes d5, now d takes c3, d takes c5 would be just a dreadful move, because I can play knight takes e3, f takes e3, and actually knight takes c5, and just structurally here, black is significantly better. But it might even be smarter to start with the move rook d5, kicking this knight away to f3, and then going knight takes c5. And now if white decides to try to double rooks on, try to challenge my rooks on d1, I can actually double. Whereas in the previous position, if I took on c5 right away, now I don't actually have the opportunity to double the rooks. So yeah, very, very interesting scenario came on the board. And after knight takes d5, Peter actually played the move rook a d1. And I think this is actually a reasonable move, because the one thing that's kind of important in this position is this tension with the d4 and c5 pawns. And I don't really want to take on e3 right away, because in this version, the d4 pawn is actually pretty decently reinforced by the e3 pawn now. So essentially, I don't have, you know, the pressure that I'd like, and white maintains this kind of fluid center. And actually the opening of the f-file here can actually really help white, because now there's sometimes pressure on f7. So instead, I actually want to kind of, you know, keep the tension just a little bit, and I did that by playing the move f6, which I think is a very, very good move, and the computer agrees as well. And the idea is, again, to challenge this knight on e5, and also to try and take some space on the king side using my king side pawn majority. Now, my knight is on e6 and kind of in the way for now, but giving myself that opportunity to potentially, you know, play king f7 and maybe even push the e-pawn later will be important if I want to use my majority. After f6, white played the move knight f3, and here is probably the critical position of the game, or one of them at least, because black actually has many different ways to try and, like, you know, play here, and unfortunately I made a pretty serious mistake that nullified any opportunity for me to kind of play with a really good initiative. So why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out how black should actually play in this position. All right, so there are you know, different ways that black can actually go forth in this one. One of the ones that actually is quite interesting, and I think the one that's probably best, is the move c4. And it looks kind of, you know, paradoxical to release tension in the center, because, you know, sometimes that could be, you know, a bad thing. But the idea here is that white has such good, black has such good light square control that actually here black is going to be able to play with quite a decent initiative on both sides of the board. So after the move c4, there's no more pressure on the d-file, there's no more diagonal for the bishop to work with, and the remaining squares the bishop has to work with are not very good either. And so for in the short term at least, this bishop on e3 is not going to be very good. And in the meantime, I can actually initiate a pawn storm on both sides of the board. So on the king side, I can play moves like g5, h5, h4, basically take a lot of space on the king side and see some dark squares. And then on the queen side, I could play the move b5 and a5 and maybe even b4. And so basically these kind of pawn moves on both sides of the board would give black a massive initiative, and white's pawn structure is less mobile, because if you think about what pawn breaks exist in white's position now, really only the b3 one is, you know, very realistic, and that actually hangs c3 in a lot of lines. So all of a sudden black would actually be a little bit for choice, in my opinion. And after a move like rook fe1, you know, maybe threatening the knight in some way, I actually can just play g5. And the point is that bishop takes g5, I can recapture with the knight. And I'm going to follow up with king f7 anyway. So after h4, king f7, we have a scenario where this knight is actually really secure on e6. I'm going to leave the e7 pawn on e7 for some time, just because, again, the dark square sort of phalanx here is actually really nice. Yeah, black's actually just doing pretty well. Now, there are some other moves that are possible that aren't as attractive. One of them is the move b5, but it's basically trying to angle for c4 anyway. And the problem with this one is that you're actually allowing d takes e5. And in this particular version with the rook on d1, already it's not actually as bad that white's spoiling his pawn structure on the king side. So after knight takes e3, f takes e3, knight takes e5, now white has the move knight d4, and there is some forking ideas if this knight leaves c5 and the b5 pawn hangs. And there's also knight c6, forking the rook and the pawn on e7. And so in this position, the position's actually pretty much equal, because both sides have 6 pawns, and white has enough activity to compensate for the weak e3 pawn. So really c4 was the best move in the position. There were other tries, but they're just not as good. Another move I will show is the move c takes d4. The reason this one isn't as good is because after bishop takes d4 and b6, this bishop actually now has scope on the diagonal. So, you know, even though it might even though this bishop is not so great, it still is more active than in positions where I shut down the center completely with c4. And yeah, you basically can see that there are basically different variations of dealing with the c-pawn here, but closing the center is actually the best. So anyways, I played a move that was absolutely dreadful, and it was basically kind of a move order problem because I was actually planning on playing c4 at some point. I just thought I didn't have to rush it, and I was constantly looking at positions where, if d takes c5, I had this ability to play knight takes e3 and spoil white's pawn structure. So I thought, why don't I improve my position before doing that, kind of like I did before the queen trade by playing the move king f7. And the problem is this king f7 actually does not improve my position because of the fact that it's actually not closed completely and the king's not yet justified on the square. And so white thought for a little bit, but then followed up with the move c4, and actually any advantage I had is completely thrown away, and now my position is actually a little in trouble. And the reason for that is every time that my knight was challenged on d5, the plan was actually to take on e3. Of course, I don't want to go back to c7 or b6 because then d5 comes on the board, and this type of position is just dreadful for black because essentially this is a protected pass pawn, and this bishop now has a really great scope on this diagonal, and white can play b3 and then hammer away at the c5 pawn and have all the space in the world. And this knight on b6 is almost like an Alekhine knight, kind of trapped on b6, restricted in the center, and just not a good position for black. So the plan was always to take on e3. But the issue here is that after knight takes e3, which I played, and f takes e3, all of a sudden this knight on f3 is actually decent, and the rook on f1, they both combine to actually create some threats against my king on f7 with the move knight e5 check. And so I'm actually allowing the knight to potentially sit on this g6 square where or essentially my pawn majority on the king side wouldn't be able to be mobilized, and white could also transfer the knight potentially to a better square. So all of a sudden here, you can see the king f7 move actually did not help me. It actually hurt me, and almost any other move would have been better because now this f takes e3 is actually a good development. And yeah, this was hugely frustrating to me when I saw this, and I was trying to figure out how to play with life in this position, because I realize now that I don't even have a better pawn structure, but white's also threatening to move d5, getting a massive space advantage in the center, and my knight on e6 is now actually not secure anymore on that square. And so really tough turn of events that I was really not pleased about. So I played the move c takes d4, and then after e takes d4, I made another blunder. Now, in part, it was because I wanted to keep the game going in some way, and I was looking at certain lines that kind of kept things steady, but it seemed like white had a risk-free position. And one of those moves I was looking at, and I didn't play, that is actually a good move, is rook d6. And the point is coming to terms with the new reality that white's probably a little bit better, and actually allowing the move d5, kicking my knight away from c7, but at least readying myself for the impending counterplay I'm going to need to create against the d5 pawn. So if I already have my rook on d6, my knight on c7, I'm about to double, and then I can try undermining this pawn chain with either b5 or e6. But I was not ready to kind of admit to just a passive position, and because of that, I actually played the move g5, which is an attempt by me to kind of justify my previous mistakes, but the problem is that they're not really justifiable. They're just mistakes. And so I really need to kind of bunker down and play just the best moves instead of trying to still play with aggressive intentions, because now I allow white the opportunity to expand even further with the move d5. And the difference here is I'm not quite ready to challenge this pawn chain in the same way I would have been if I had played rook d6 instead. So after d5, I now had another choice to make about how I was going to play this position, had I come to terms with the realities of the position. and I had not. I had simply not come to terms with the realities of the position. The best move in the position is knight c5, and the point is that you allow b4 hitting your knight with tempo, but after knight a4, your knight's hopping around and you might get some counterplay. And one of the key ideas is that after knight d4, you actually play knight b6, and you allow white to get the exchange. And this is actually a line I'd considered, but I was like, I don't want to play this position. And the point is that after knight e6, knight takes e4, knight takes f8, and king takes f8, black does have a pawn for the exchange, and now because the d5 pawn is isolated, it's actually difficult to advance, and my knight can kind of hop around and cause some trouble for black, or for white. So it's actually not quite a winning position, and it's defensible. But again, I had not quite come to grips with this, and was still thinking, I can still play kind of tricky fashion, and maybe white will make a mistake pressing forward. But this type of position where you sack an exchange to defend, you maybe get a pawn forward, and you try to hold in this type of endgame, is actually something I've done before effectively. In the second round of the Lüneburg Chess Festival, I'd actually played a game against a Grandmaster. I think his last name was Vorobyov, and I actually had a position very similar to this with queens on the board that I was able to hold, where I had rook, knight, and I had a knight and a pawn versus a rook, and was able to hold that one. So sometimes you can get away with this, but it's about sensing the danger and then taking your chances when you can, and I hadn't quite sensed how dangerous it was, so I didn't do it. So instead of playing knight c5, I played the move knight f4. And the idea here was I was still kind of adamant about playing actively and maybe breaking with my e-pawn and kind of going for it, but it's just not what the position requires. White now played the very obvious move knight d4, and it's just a very decent move. I mean, you basically cover the e6 square, keep an eye on the backward e-pawn, and white's now threatening move like g3, kicking the knight away from f4 and then jumping into e6. And now it's kind of crunch time. I'm really on the back foot now. White has more space. I really have to be quite accurate here. And I made another blunder with the move rook d7, which is just a dreadful, dreadful move. Now, again, I've said this before. I need to come to reality with the terms of the position and try the move e5. The idea here is that I try to get some pieces off the board and try to get like a drawn ending. So obviously, if their en passant happens, I'll take with the knight. We trade some pieces, and this type of position with equal material, my king is fairly active, which I think kind of offsets potentially white having the better pawn majority right now at the queenside pawn majority. I think means that black will be fine here. So you wouldn't want to do that. Instead, after e5, you'd want to play rook takes f4. And the point is that after g takes f4, you have knight e6 in this particular version. And the difference here is that white actually retains a 4 versus 2 passed pawn situation on the queen side, which is extremely dangerous to contend with. And so I think this position is is pretty much holdable, but a more difficult hold. Essentially, white can try to undermine the pawn structure on the king side and then press onward. And in this type of circumstance, black would eventually hold the game, but it would be a tough hold for sure. One of the key things is that the reason white has to go and maybe go for the h-pawn is because with the king on e6, there's no way for the king to come forward and help white mobilize with the d-pawn. So basically, if white kind of held fast and just kept the pawn on d5, black's king was just going to march to d6 and blockade it. And so that's why white need to try and make use of the majority quickly. But that was kind of the best chance, I think, for white in this particular scenario if I played e5. And in most cases, the road would essentially lead to a drawn rook endgame. Instead, I played rook d7 with illusions of grandeur, essentially. I thought that I'd be able to blockade with the rook on d7, play the rook to c8, attack the pawn on c4, and then play e5, and after I get all my pieces on the ideal squares. But this actually is a huge, huge tactical oversight, which Peter saw pretty much immediately, and was really, I think, another example of the chess blindness I had in this game, because I pretty much made, several mistakes in a row in this here with the this knight f4 move, with the king f7 move, and now this rook d7 move. And this is actually the worst of them all, because this actually gives me a losing position after the move knight e6, or nearly losing rather. And remarkably here, I can't actually take this knight, because if I take, after d takes e6 check, king takes e6, rook fe1 check forces my king away from the protection of the d7 rook, just picking up a full rook. So essentially, I can't actually take the knight on e6 because of those tactics, which means that I just have to move the rook. And that means that I'm just losing a clear pawn for nothing. And the really big problem with it is that after the move I played, rook c8, knight takes e4, g takes f4, and rook takes f4, I've not only lost a pawn, I've also lost some other important things. First of all, I've lost my queenside pawn majority, so there's no queenside pawn majority anymore. Second of all, this h6 pawn is now actually a huge weakness, because my, one of the kingpins of my pawn chain, this pawn g5, is now gone. And so with these pawns split, white actually has an additional target as well. And so I didn't just lose a pawn, actually. I lost a pawn, I lost the strength of my pawn chain, and I've lost any semblance of control of the center. And the combination of these factors makes this position extremely close to winning, if not technically winning. And so it was just a huge, huge blow, and it's just a huge, it's just a huge letdown when essentially you have a situation where 25 moves in, you're a pawn down and a rook ending, you have no chance to win against someone 500 points lower than you. So it's just not a good feeling at all. But I was just, thinking, you know what? A lot of rook end games, even if you're a pawn down, can be drawn. Try to make that happen. Try to defend best you can, and play quickly. That was the other key thing. If you play quickly, you continue to ask him important questions with less time, and maybe you'll get your shot. And so that was basically, I thought the only chance I had was to draw the game here, and that was what I was going to try to do. So the first thing to do is how do you even play this position, being so passive, obviously being down material. And the idea is to try and get counterplay. And so I started here with the move a6. And the idea here was to undermine white's queenside pawn chain with the move b5. So the point was that if I undermine this pawn chain, maybe d5 is a little bit weaker, I could be in good shape. Now, it's funny, my idea was to play b5, but it actually turns out that the best move in this position, instead of a6, is actually b5 right away. And remarkably, the point is that after c takes b5, rook c2, this rook is actually remarkably active on the second rank, and even with black being 2 pawns down, black seems to have quite a bit of counterplay. So if you go rook f2, now there's rook c4, and the idea is to go rook b4 and recover the pawn that way. And if you go a3 to stop that, then there's rook a4. Very, very strange, unusual sequence, but the idea now is to go rook a5 and secure the pawn from the 5th rank. And then if rook f3, trying to go rook b3 to deal with that threat, now black can go rook a5 anyway, and after rook b3, go rook b7. And the point is now black's actually going to wind up getting the b5 pawn, but after d6, e takes d6, rook takes on b5, and rook cf3, or rook bf3, now there's pressure on f6. And this is just a hard line for black to play, but essentially after rook takes b2, rook takes f6, king e7, some checks, and then rook a6, it appears that black is going to lose this one, but white actually does need to be precise in that sequence just to get to this position with 2 connected pass pawns versus the lone A pawn. And I'm not so sure my opponent would have found all those moves. So the computer does advocate b5 as a decent try. And yeah, very, very interesting line where you can see just how important rook activity matters. So anyways, I played a6, and now white, I think, played a very, very good move to kind of nip this b5 plan in the bud by playing the move b4. And I think this is a hugely important move, and one that I'm not so sure everyone would play. I think a lot of people might say, oh, I would play b3 to just defend the chain. But the problem is now if I play b5, you can't really play c5 ever, and it's going to be difficult to actually mobilize your pawns. Another thing that, I think some people would do is actually play a4 with the same idea of trying to limit b5 this way. And I think now I would have been more keen to play the move b5, because if we exchange a few times here, now these pawns are all isolated and split, and it's not so easy to push them. And again, if rook b4, yeah, this position I don't think would be the easiest one to convert. Although I think white is still maybe close to winning here. The other thing actually after a4 is I could consider the move a5, actually just, fixing white's pawn majority, and then go a5, b6, and try to defend that way. I don't believe that would lead to a successful defense, but it is possible. And I think b4 just kind of prevents me from getting the really, really nice blockade that I was hoping for. And so in that way, I think it's a good decision. After b4, I played the move a5 now, and this just goes to show just how important it is to kind of blockade these pawns, because I'm actually trying to give up a pawn to control the c5 square. So if b takes e5 is played, now I think I would actually play the move rook a8. And the point is that I'm going to pick up the a5 pawn. If you play c5, I could take here, and I'm attacking a2 and c5. So very, very important just to kind of get some squares, get some files for rooks, because if I'm defending super passively, I thought that would just be my doom, especially because I also have this additional weakness on h6 that I have to contend with. So after a5, white actually played the move a3, which I think is a very reasonable move. Another move the computer points out, and this is actually one that I feared during the game, was actually the move b5. And again, it might seem unusual to just willingly give c5 this blockading square for my rook, but in certain positions, once the king gets centralized, maybe gets to d3 or d4, and then the rook on f4 is free to roam around, and it can maybe remaneuver itself to the h file. Sometimes it can maneuver itself to the a file to attack the a pawn, and I think the combination of threats will be too difficult for me to hold everything together. So I think b5 is possible, but a3 is definitely more flexible. I now took on b4, and after a takes b4, played the move b6. And you can see just for the moment, I'm holding up the c5 break. White now played rook fd4, overprotecting the d5 pawn. I played rook a7 now, very, very important to try and seek out activity if I can. And so at least now the a file's open. I might have some counterplay horizontally on the second and third rank. And in some positions I was thinking maybe rook a4 is actually nice, pushing the pawn to b5, where I finally get to blockade the majority again. But now white played d6, and I think this is actually a very, very good move, because all of a sudden here, I've kind of left the nest for a moment to try and get counterplay, and it's exactly when white decides to strike in the center when I'm not coordinated. And I was thinking about, well, what do I do with d6? Do I leave it there? Do I take? What do I do? What do I do? And I decided that e takes d6 was probably going to lose me the game. But remarkably, e takes d6 is actually kind of holdable. And so I'll show you why it's the case. I did not take on d6. But the point is that after e takes d6, rook takes d6, I thought that this position was just not playable because rook f1 is a major threat, taking on f6 with check, and then also collecting h6 afterward. And whenever we had the scenarios, almost like that previous rook endgame I was showing before where black was getting in this b5 move, if there's a 2 versus 1 at the end, it's not going to be good. If there's 2 connected pass pawns versus 1 lone pawn somewhere else on the board, white's 99% of the time winning those types of endings. And so here I thought it was the same, but actually after rook takes c4 and rook f1, black actually can play rook takes b4, and after rook takes f6, go king g8. And again, this is extremely strange to me, from afar. But the point is that if rook g6 check is played, this is the check I always feared, because then if I move my king to h7, there's rook takes h6 with check, and capturing the pawns with check spells my doom. But here I actually have the move rook g7. And it's a remarkable resource that gets me now counterplay against the g2 pawn. So that if you play, rook takes b6 is a move, but if you play rook takes h6, now I can check on b1, then check on b2, and then g2 is actually dropping. So black actually holds on in those variations. And then, of course, if you go rook takes b6, black is just happy to trade these rooks and then play the position a pawn down, but hg versus h is always a draw. Like, this is just impossible for white to win because black is able to set up positions where they check from behind when white actually winds up trading the h pawn for the h pawn. Basically, once the pawn gets to g6 and the king is on f5, then the rook comes from behind and actually checks. So this type of position is just totally drawn. And because of that, the position is actually holdable. So instead of rook g6 check, if you play rook takes h6 right away, here is actually the trickier line. Black can actually play rook a1 check, and then after king f2, rook a2 check. Remarkably, it's just a repetition because the rook is actually cutting off the king from running away on the 4th rank. And if this king comes closer to the rook on b4, then black will just collect the pawn on g2, and white would actually only be left with the h pawn to try to win. And, h pawns are the worst. H and a pawns, rook pawns in general, are the worst pawns to try and win a rook endgame. So that would actually be a draw as well. But I was not able to see this repetition from afar. It just seemed like white was collecting my pawns on the 6th rank, and because of that, I didn't go for it. So instead, after d6, I play what I considered to be my next best chance, which was the move e6. And the idea here, as hopeless as it seemed, was that I was going to have to try to blockade the pawn that is actually on the 6th rank. And I thought that it was extremely dangerous, but at least I realized that the pawn can't just run to d7 super quickly, because if you do go d7, I can go rook d8 and then king e7 and actually corral the d pawn. So I thought that at least if d7 was played right away, I would probably draw the game. And but I did think that because the pawn was so far advanced, I wasn't totally I didn't totally believe that I can hold some type of blockade here. But it actually turned out to be, trickier than I thought. So anyways, after e6, white played the move c5. Very, very good move now, taking advantage of the fact that because my rook has actually left the d file, I can't take on c5 twice, because if I do so, now d7 just queens the pawn, and I can't get a rook to d8 in time. So can't do that. So after c5, I actually only took once, and then played rook d7 back. But at least here, I'm actually still blockading the pawns, and c5 is something that has to be defended now. So white now played the move rook c4, threatening the move c6. And now I played the move rook c6. And I'm a pawn down. White has connected pass pawns on d6 and c5, which are not obstructed by any black pawns. They're just blockaded by the rooks. But at least white does not have a direct win in this very moment. And so white is going to need to show some technique to demonstrate that this is a win and get the full point. And, I felt at least good about that at least I put up a fight where I was not making it totally easy for my young opponent to finish the job. So anyways, after rook c6, white played the move rook d3, which is an interesting move, trying in some lines, I think, to shift over to the h file, the g file, and take advantage of my weak pawn. And again, that's why this position is actually losing, because not only are these pawns connected here, I also have targets that basically make my remaining pawns kind of weak. And so that's really the huge problem. In my opinion, it would have been a little bit better to start with g4. And the reason for this is because then the pawn on h6 would be a fixed weakness, because I couldn't push it to h5 anymore, and it would kind of be difficult to kind of contend with, because now rook d3 h3 is actually even more problematic. But he wound up actually getting to play g4, so it didn't make such a huge difference. So after rook d3, I now played e5, and e5 is actually a slight mistake, and I should have taken the opportunity now to actually play h5 myself. Now, the reason I did not play h5 is because I thought maybe this pawn is just going to be a target anyway with something like rook h3. But one of the key things to note is that if you actually rush with rook h3, I actually have the move rook takes d6. And all of a sudden, the rook on c4 is actually undefended, and so a position like this is actually just, completely holdable, and it's all of a sudden a draw, because I can just come back around to the pawn on d6 and recover that, and this type of position is just a dead draw. And so, yeah, so actually I'd be able to kind of I'd probably be able to hold this with precise play. And actually, I shouldn't say this is a dead draw, because if rook d4, rook h7 is actually kind of a problem. But I think maybe black could hold this. In any case, the point is that if white plays g3, trying to kind of hold up my h-pawn and kind of still make it a fixed target, the difference is that because this pawn is not on g4, it hasn't actually restrained my f and e pawns. And so I can actually get the opportunity to play e5, king g2, king e6, h3, and then rook d8. And whenever the king gets closer, I could even consider playing the move f5 at some point, and really making use of both my f and e pawns as kind of like almost like a barricade to stop the king from actually getting into my position. And that's actually not something that I'm able to do if the pawn remains on h6. Because if the pawn remains on h6, even if my pawn is on f5 and e5, white might have the opportunity to actually waltz in to the h5 square sometime and actually target the h6 pawn. And ultimately, I think that would probably be the winning strategy for white. Instead, after e5, white played the move g4 now, and unfortunately, white did get to fix my pawn on h6, and I thought, oh, this is probably not good, because now, all of a sudden, the white king has two seemingly pleasant entry points. One is getting to the e4 square, and then maybe to f5, from which it can, maybe get in through the center. And then the other way is maybe to break the blockade via h5, where my king would have to run and tend to the h-pawn, and then maybe that distraction would enable white to break through. But anyways, after g4, I went king e6, trying to actually at least cut off the entry square via f5, and also in some lines just controlling the d5 and f5 squares. And white went king f2, and I went rook g7. I thought this rook g7 move was hugely important, because essentially what I was trying to do was I was trying to kind of force white to play h3 and actually cut off the rook from getting that square and getting counterplay against my h-pawn. So I thought rook g7 was a really important move. The other point was that if you go king g2, I thought that this actually gave me the opportunity to potentially go h5. And trading the h-pawn, trading my weakness in the position, I thought would help me try to defend, because it was really not doing much for me and was going to be a target. So I felt pretty good about this rook g7 move. So anyways, after rook g7, white did play h3, which I was happy about, cutting off the the square from the rook, but I thought this was a small victory for me. And defending like this, like, you kind of acknowledge some of these small victories. I now went rook g8, just kind of waiting, because I didn't think I needed to return back to d7 right away, because if white played d7, I would just go rook d8 and attack that pawn and corral it. So I thought that by keeping the rook on g8, I'm still stopping this king g3 idea. And now white went king e3, trying to kind of, I don't know, maybe get to e4 and kind of wait. And here I played the move rook g7, just kind of waiting. And then white played the move king e4. And here it's kind of crunch time, because the question is, well, what do I do here? How do I improve? What's the situation here? Because if I wait passively again, now that the king's on e4, the white rook might spin around and try and get some counterplay behind my position. So here, after king e4, I played the move rook d7, waiting for just one more moment, because I thought that now, if the white rook went away to a3, I have rook takes d6, taking advantage of the rook on c4 being unprotected. So I thought, let white show what they're trying to do. So I'll just wait for a moment. And after rook d7, white played the move rook d5. And this was a move I was very, very happy to see, because on the one hand, I think white played rook d5 to now free the c4 rook. Now there's no tactic with rook takes d6, because the rook is actually defending c5, and now the rook would be free to move. But the issue here is that now the king is actually tied to the defense of the rook on d5, and this actually enables me to get in this bit of counterplay I was hoping to get earlier, which was the move h5. And amazingly, g takes h5 is not possible because of f5 check. So if that happens, the king is forced back. I can take the rook on d5, and all of a sudden it'd be black that would be a rook up. So amazingly, I'm finally able to get rid of this h-pawn, which was kind of a problem for me. And this was a real, this really made me excited, because I thought that now if I'm able to trade the h-pawn for the g-pawn, then the remaining pawn on g4 would be a target for me. So it would be hard for white to kind of spin around and get counterplay behind my position if my rook on could always just go to g7 and attack the g4 pawn. So I thought this was a huge, huge turn of events. After h5, white played rook d3 back, kind of acknowledging that the f5 check idea was real. And now I played h takes g4, and after h takes g4, I've gotten rid of my weakness. Now, this position is still probably losing. Again, these two connected pass pawns are so far advanced. I don't believe I can hold this blockade, but it makes it a lot more difficult. After h takes g4, I now played rook d8, just waiting in the position. And here, actually, my opponent looked at the board and studied it for like about 10 minutes, trying to figure out ways through in the position, and was also getting a little bit low on time, because I'd been playing fairly quickly after I made those blunders early on. And remarkably, before even making a move, he actually offered me a draw. And normally, you know, that's not the right protocol to offer a draw. You're supposed to actually make your move and then offer a draw. But my position was so... there's no way I can win this game, and a draw is what I was actually playing for. So to actually have your opponent just offer you a draw like this, I was like, what a gift. And I very, very quickly accepted. And then we paused the clocks, and I asked him, why did you offer me a draw? You can keep playing forever. And he just could not see a way through. And, you know, it is a tough position to win. I mean, it's not like you're going to win in the next two moves, but it's also a position you can play forever with zero risk. Like, there's literally no way that white can win this game unless, or excuse me, there's no way that black can win this game unless they blunder a rook, basically. And, yeah, there's just not a great decision by my opponent. So the question is actually how to win this one. And I think I don't think white could win by just staying put with the rooks on the D and C files. I think one of the rooks would either have to move off those files, or the white king would have to reposition itself. And I think the way white could try to win is to try and bring the king over via h5 and trying to invade this way. And so one of the things I was thinking about a little bit earlier, as I mentioned, was this idea with king f3, king g3, king h4, and I think that would actually be a decent winning try. Even in positions like this, in this position where my idea was essentially to play for h5, I think white should have tried to bring this king essentially via the h file to h5 and pressure the h6 pawn like that. Yeah, I think that would have been a slightly better try. But hey, it wasn't an easy win for white, and I think white was also probably just being 500 points down, happy with the draw, and so getting a draw against someone so higher rated than you is, I think, something that young players are always kind of happy about. But sometimes you should be looking for more, and this was definitely one of those times. Anyway, I escaped with a draw on this one. I was happy to get it, and was gonna just move on from this disaster. So anyway, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like or subscribe to the channel, and if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.